I will start my speech in three, two, one. Panels where the government think that today's education is not enough for the needs of society and the needs of the student themselves. And so we think that progressive education is the way to go, and therefore we, the government, supports today's motion. But first, a few points of setup. Firstly, about the status quo. Realize panels that the current models of education is effectively dysfunctional and or requires a major fix to be viable for the students. To understand this, we must first characterize and understand the objectives of education and know what good education actually stands for. There are 4 points. A, learning to know. B, learning to do, that is practical skills. C, learning to be, that is self growth or knowing to be a human. And D, learning to live together in peace, right? See how current models of education serve not all these pillars. They only serve the first one in their exploits, right? With this model being telling the children to more often than not learn passively and in a more unengaging way, forcing them to just regurgitate information and not understanding them like they should, like they're machines that are made to just regurgitate information all of the time but regurgitate the information that is given to them, input into them, and output the same thing in tests and exam, things like that, right? The problem with such capacity to interest students in the process of learning has two layers. A, to the individual, preventing the children to then operate in the real world effectively because of the regurgitation. Because how many people find factoids that they learned in middle school, for example, to be useful in their day-to-day life, right? Like the periodic table or the digits of pi and things like that, right? These factoids are then forced to be taken in by the students and regurgitated later, but they do not serve any kind of function to their life, right? But also B, the society then fails to have successors that is better than their predecessors, fails in continuing knowledge through education, and fails to guarantee the fate of the society itself, right? And this is a very big problem as a society. You have to have good education that will always be subsistent throughout the years, throughout the ages. But the point of framing panels, this is a proposal debate. So the parameters that we as the government must fulfill are as such. One, why progressive education must replace traditional education and the problems of traditional education can be solved with progressive education. And two, why such a change will not jeopardize education nor burn it in such a way that it completely debilitates the system of education in of itself and the state, for example. The opposition then has to prove the inverse of this, which is why traditional education is viable enough to then not be able to replace and there is no problem with it. But also second, why such a change of progressive education will then completely jeopardize the nation's education and completely destroy its funds, for example. But let's define the progressive education we want first. One, it is a system that teaches concepts, logic, and general knowledge like it does now, but without the exams, without the regurgitation, without just knowing these things, right? Because two, a system that based on the knowledge taught teaches how to apply such knowledge into real world skills, right? But also three, a system that caters to students' own interests, needs, and rate of growth. For example, a student may want to learn mathematics, for example, or may want to learn biology, or may want to learn writing, for example. And the school must then provide these curriculums or packages that suits them, that suits most of the majority, right? But also, this kind of system needs to go with the rate of growth a student naturally has, the rate of understanding that they naturally has, the speed in which they learn and understand things. The system must then cater to such things, right? But also special needs like learning disabilities and learning quirks and such like that, right? But also four, we want a system that supports and facilitates a friendly environment for learning and socializing, right? And this is the kind of curriculum, the kind of system we want to exist in the world right now that is replacing traditional education. But a point of weight panels, on their side, they might say that the strain made by progressive education and all its schemes and concepts and all of these complicated, overcomplicated things that do not just involve regurgitation and exams must then prove a burden to the education system and to the state as a whole to then fund this education system, right? But realize panels that in today's world, the strain on traditional schools is very big also, right? And the strain is all about funding. For example, facilities may be lacking to then give these children the education that they need, but also wages to teachers that work every day, that work very hard every day to then teach children. They do not get the wages that they deserve, right? But justifying it by saying that oh, it is a duty. The teaching is the reward in of itself, right? And this creates essentially teachers that are unmotivated by the work and therefore making the learning process even worse than they could be if they're given proper funds, proper wages. Even sometimes they have no pens or things like that for their children, right? But also upkeep on the facilities when they break down. Usually these things go very slowly and are not effective enough to then replace the facility in a timely manner to then always have an effective learning period, right? So even now there is strain in the education system in of itself and the government cannot provide it at this point, right? To eliminate strain then the government must provide adequate funds to education, but right now it is not the case, right? So but also realize that progressive schools does not necessarily need more funds anyway. The amount of funds that is needed by progressive schools is not necessarily always higher than traditional schools, right? So the strain is comparable. For example, one can learn skills with low funds, right? You don't need high tech machinery to learn real world skills, especially, for example, when the funds from exams, the funds from these other schemes of traditional education is then diverted into the schemes of progressive education in of itself. And so there is funding there already. But even if there is no funding on both sides, right? The amount of funding governments usually invest in education is far less than it should be. For example, like America, where wages of teachers are very, very much lower than they should be, right? And therefore, I think this weighing this kind of risk is then mitigated in our case, and not if not even mitigated, it is the same on both sides anyway. But to my points of arguments, I have 2 points of arguments: A, preserving and advancing society's level of advancement, and B, the quality of individuals in life. I will start with A, preserving and advancing society's level of advancement. Realize, panels, that human knowledge and innovation is a culmination of our history as a species, right? This is enabled by education and knowledge transfer from one generation to the next. Even, for example, verbal teachings from a parent is education, because the point of education is to then transfer knowledge that the past generation already knew, to then be developed further down the line in the future by newer generations, and then iterated upon that again and again and again until it creates innovation and advancement, right? With the effective education, this it as an effective knowledge transfer, human knowledge does not pass on and die with the generations. And this is what we see in the real world, right? Fallen societies, fallen civilizations, lost knowledge from all over the world, all over the history of humanity is lost, right? Because the education is not there, or education is because when the society falls, of course, education is not going to be existent there, right? But this means that bad education equals the stagnation or regression of a society. Progressive schooling then fixes this problem because it enhances the transference of knowledge by teaching usable skills and engaging students by making them not learn passively but actively, by learning skills that are actually usable to them and actually interesting to them, which is a very big thing, right? Students have to be interested to learn then, because even if our human nature is to learn, to accrue more information, the one has to be interested in something to want to learn and invest time in it, right? But point of comparison, Miles, on their side, there is a high risk of education being so ineffective that the society regresses or even stagnates because of it, right? Because the knowledge is not transferred properly, even with resources like books, for example. Even things like that, with bad enough education, the people cannot even is not even literate, right? Things like that. But even if it is not this extreme, there is still a kind of doting education system that is not effective enough for knowledge transfers and engaging enough for these kinds of complete transfers of knowledge between the previous generation and the next, leading to a more ineffective society, right? And leading to a more slowly advancing society. But in our case, because progressive education enhances the learning experience and therefore attractiveness of knowledge, society's safety is then more satisfied, right? But even if it is not the case, at least education is engaging enough for these people to then be useful to the students. But next, my points of arguments, which is ensuring the quality of individuals, right? The system focuses on vegetation at this point in time. In living, people need to have both knowledge and usable skills to prosper, and not only factoids. It is useless if a student can regurgitate the periodic table but does not know what to do with their lives in the end, right? Because life is not just about remembering things, like it is about applying them. So what sense it is then to force students to learn factoids with no practical use? A more dynamic system is needed to produce quality individuals, and therefore traditional education just doesn't make sense and isn't justified to exist at all.